For more than 30 years, we've published unique stories, insights, and case studies, from neural machine translation to racial bias and localization.
Visit multilingual.com/subscribe and start reading today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Multilingual Summer Series panel. Today we'll talk about how translation and linguistic validation play a vital role in amplifying the patient's voice by ensuring that all patients are equally heard, regardless of the language they speak or the country they live in. My name is Ana Sofia Correia. I'm an English to Portuguese medical translator and writer. For the past 14 years, I've been translating and writing content for clinical trials, medical devices, regulatory submissions, and education and marketing campaigns. In addition, I work closely with patient associations by translating information materials, awareness-raising campaigns, and service. I'm honored to be moderating this discussion with Anna Richards, Kokoro Yoshikawa, and Trishna Bharadia. And so let's start with the introductions. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anna. So I'm Anna Richards, and I'm currently working at ViteAccess. And my background is actually in law and French. I was a legal French translator living in France, and then the call came back for me to come back home to Wales. And I'm currently working as commercial lead at ViteAccess, and I work quite heavily we work on digital healthcare study apps that are localized into many different countries. So now I'm involved in the project management on that side. I'm also a cognitive debriefing consultant, which I'll talk about what that means as well, I guess, at some point, because not many people might know. But I'll pass over to Trishna to see about her.
So, hi everyone, I'm Trishna Bharadia. I'm the owner of the Spark Global, which is a patient engagement and advocacy consultancy. So I work to get the patient voice heard throughout the healthcare journey and medicine's development life cycle. So that includes working with organizations to produce patient content, materials, information, and services, and making sure that the patient voice is being properly incorporated into all of these. I got involved in this space as a result of being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2008 at the age of 28. But I also come at this from another angle, as I have an understanding of some of the challenges that there are when it comes to translation, because I've also worked for almost 20 years as a Spanish to English translator for a business intelligence company. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, and thank you for having me. And I'll pass over to Kokoro.
Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kokoro, and I am currently working as a freelance translator. I grew up in Japan and raised in Japan. About 20 years ago, I decided to move to Montreal in Canada. I previously worked as a nurse in Japan, and in Canada, I worked for this quality assurance, video game quality assurance company, working as a linguist, translator, interpreter, and coordinator, commercial coordinator, and customer support service coordinator. So, but then after that, I decided to do freelancing, and that's who I am right now. And the interesting point is that thinking back, I've been always a mediator, liaison, or messenger in every single job I had, helping people to effectively and efficiently communicate. And as a nurse, it was very important to make sure that patient's voice is being heard by everyone, of course, like by the HCPs. And so I had a chance to speak to a lot of people and during that time. And I worked at the head and neck surgery department. And that was very so patients basically like they may have lost ability to speak normally, like speak as we do. So they had to some of them removed their vocal cords and needed to find alternative ways to communicate. And some are probably hard of hearing. And after the surgery, it's very hard to communicate. And so, it was 20 years ago. Now I work as a translator, and I also work on materials that are related to IT. I've myself was saying the technology advancing, and I'm very looking forward to see how we can harness the power of technology and also the communication and the language altogether. And yeah, and so I'm very looking forward to the discussion today. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for introducing yourselves. So I'll just want to say quickly that if anyone watching us has any question, you can drop your message, your question in the chat here in Kudo or in the platform where you're watching the live stream. And now let's dive into our discussion. I would like to start with Trishna and ask in your what does patient voice mean to you? So it's such an abstract term for those who are not familiar with it. So if you could just explain what patient voice means to you.
Sure. So I think it's very important to remember that when we're talking about the patient voice, we're talking about basically anybody who has an interest in making sure that the outcomes for somebody who's been diagnosed with a condition are going to be as positive as possible. So that patient voice might include the person themselves, it might include a caregiver, it might include a family member. It's about ensuring that that person's wants, their needs, their requirements, their wishes are being heard throughout that healthcare journey. And when we're talking about the medicine's development life cycle, we're talking about making sure that how patients are treated within clinical trials, what are their unmet needs, what are the research priorities, how are clinical trials designed to make sure that they're going to get the best out of the people who are taking part in them. That for me is really about the patient voice. When I speak about the patient voice, I always add that caveat that it's about the patient, the caregiver, the family. It's about everybody who's involved in that person's care, really, if they've been diagnosed with a condition. For me, embedding that patient voice in the healthcare journey, in the medicine's development life cycle, is about improving the outcomes for patients at the end of the day, making sure that the healthcare journey and the medicine's development life cycle is more relevant, it's more effective, and, as I said, much more positive for people living with a condition.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. And you mentioned the the importance of hearing the patient's voice in the medicine development cycle. And I think that this is where probably Ana can pitch in the discussion with her her work as in linguistic validation. So, what do you think that linguistic validation is one of the major contributing factors to make sure that the patient voice is heard?
Oh, completely. So I'll just go back and just say really what linguistic validation is in case anyone's not familiar with that. It's usually done on what we call patient-reported outcomes. So these are questionnaires that a patient would complete potentially within a clinical trial or in another study that was looking to capture the data from the patient. So really trying to capture the patient's voice. And what you ask in there is incredibly important, because if it's translated incorrectly, your data is wrong. And then you're not going to get the outcomes that you want to see. You won't have the correct data, the quality will be off, and it could essentially cause the whole trial to fall through. So predominantly a lot of these questionnaires, they're written in English. There's a lot of Anglocentrism within the creation of them.
And often, actually, Ana, the PROs themselves, even if they're being created in English, the PROs themselves often don't have patients involved in their creation in the first place.
Exactly. So there can be different approaches to the development, but often, yes, you're right, there can be maybe just the developers, so academics and clinicians involved, but no patient input. This is slowly changing. There is becoming more and more contribution, but it's still, what I've seen in my experience, is still Anglo-centric, and there's not that element of, will this work in other countries? So this is where we would essentially look at the content and do something like a translatability assessment to see, would this actually work around the world? And often you find that these questions, this split stem, which is something like, you will do the following activity and then it's go for a run and that kind of thing. And in certain languages, that just doesn't flow very nicely in that same structure, and they have to reformat the entire thing. So within linguistic validation, at least you have these steps, which is multiple, you can have 2 forward translations, for example, and then those 2 translations are harmonized to create the best of both version. Then you can get that back translated into the source language. I'm going to go with English to keep it easy.
Yes.
And then that is analysed against the original version. And there can be multiple people then analysing that to say, okay, is the nuance right? Is that what they meant? So if we had, for example, the question, are you feeling blue? And just before you had, are you feeling very sad? How in other languages do you know if that has been distinguished correctly to have the same concept behind it as the original English version? So you do that with the back translation, but then the crucial bit is actually talking to patients in the next step, and that's the cognitive debriefing step, and that's really where you're going to find out if the meaning was conveyed, because people who this can be tested with, they can explore that language and they can say, well, blue makes me think of, I'm slightly sad, but I'm not feeling, overly upset or depressed. And you can explore those concepts and say, okay, would this be a better word? Would that be a better word? And this is where you'd really find the true translation and the true patient voice of what they would convey to answering that question.
Yes. So, and it's so the patients are actually heard during the process of linguistic validation, and like Trishna said, sometimes even in the development step, patients are not sufficiently heard, and that has to change. And like Ana said, it's gradually changing, but.
I think, sorry to interrupt, Ana Sofia, but I think it's going to become even more important as we have more and more clinical trials being run in lots of different countries. So in order to make sure that the data that's being captured is comparable between countries, these PROs need to be comparable. You need to make sure that what you mean in one country is the same as what you mean in another country. And as it becomes easier to run trials on a global scale, this will become even more important.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, like, as well, when you say that clinical trials are becoming really I mean, they've already been quite prevalent, but even more so now because we've had the pandemic, and they've become decentralized. It means that more and more can be run because they can be digital studies now, so people can do them at home.
Yep.
And with aspects like COVID, I guess there's more and more questions on this being brought up as well. And just to give an example, what might be considered a lockdown in one country is completely different in others. I mean, if you take the UK, for example, it's very confusing.
Well, it's interesting because when so I live in a shielding household. In the UK, people know what a shielding household is. But if you were to say that to somebody in another country, I don't know, in say India, for example, they wouldn't automatically know what it is. And you need to then go on to explain, well, it means that you only leave your house for, essential medical purposes. And, at some point you could even go outside into the garden and things like that. But it's about that terminology. And as you said, Anna, what is a restriction or a lockdown or a term in one country isn't necessarily the same in another.
Completely.
Yeah. Yes, and yes, cultural nuances in every clinical trial and in every material we translate has an enormous importance to address. And Kokoro, as a translator and with your experience as a nurse and from a different cultural background, how do you see this process of cultural adaptation in translation, and the importance of making sure that patients from different cultural backgrounds understand completely the materials you work with?
Yes, I think it's a very difficult subject. And although that we see the globalization and the becoming more and more increasingly happening, um, Anna mentioned that the Anglo-centric. And when I speak about the paired, like language paired translation between English and Japanese, it's always we have to do localization at one point anyway, because the English is the culture that is like a low context, and the Japanese is like a high context culture. That is a challenge for us to find a correct word that is versatile enough, precise enough, and cover different age groups and different patient groups. And also, like Anna mentioned, or like other people mentioned about the COVID, the situation may be different from there. And also, so those small things, very precision. At the same time, we have to make sure it's versatile and general enough. That is like a great challenge for us. And so, this is why I make research search or excuse me. So on the blogs, I read patients' blogs and sometimes the vlogs. And I also check patient advocate or support group website to see what kind of words they are actually using when they express their conditions. And that is, that's something that the general feedback I can give on this topic, I think.
Yes, and yeah, and it's not just when you think about patient-facing materials, we are talking about so many materials, and we're not just talking about those traditional and mandatory materials that we have to translate in clinical trials, but it's so important to create multilingual content, from patient engagement materials to patient conclusion to clinical trial end of study reports. And Trishna, do you think that non-English speaking patients are currently sufficiently informed? Are they getting the enough information and relevant information in a sufficient amount to want to be willing to participate in clinical trials? And what can we do more about it to increase engagement?
So I think currently the answer is no, they're not. Especially if you are somebody who speaks a different language, but you're living in an English-speaking country. And I think that's where there can be a real issue in terms of making sure that people who speak other languages are being fully informed about the clinical trial process. They're being given the information that they need in order to make informed decisions. I think one of the ways that we can really help to overcome this is by making sure that clinical trial sponsors, clinical research organizations, patient organizations as well, are really making connections with the communities in order to be able to identify people that can act as interpreters, can help with producing information that is in the target languages, in order so that they get the information, but within that, they're also getting the patient voice heard within that information. Because there's also an element of, it's not just a case of let's get something in English and let's just translate it. We also need to make sure that, and Kokoro has touched on this, some of those cultural nuances, the cultural sensitivities are also taken into account when the information is being produced in those different languages. I also think that there needs to be much more work to ensure that site staff, for example, and healthcare professionals, there's more effort made to encourage people from different backgrounds, from different linguistic backgrounds into those positions and roles, so that if somebody, I don't know, for example, let's talk about in the US, if somebody who is Hispanic wants to find out more information about clinical trials in Spanish, they have somebody who is qualified to be able to speak about the clinical trials or the medical research that is going on in that language, rather than necessarily relying on somebody telling them in English and then using an interpreter to be able to convey that information. So I think there's a lot of things that we can be doing. It's not just a case of, okay, let's do one thing and that might work. I think it's a case of a multi-pronged attack, really.
And when you say multi-pronged attack, you're talking about several media to disseminate the information, right? And today we're talking about social media and digital platforms. So Anna, in your experience, I know that you have you focus on, for example, localization for patient apps and patient diaries and digital formats for patient-reported outcomes. So do you feel that there's a constant move towards those media, and within that context, are they sufficiently translated or localized into every language, in order to, not every language of course, but the relevant languages, to make sure that patients are understood and heard?
I would say yes for our side, just because in our studies we take a big stance on localization. We have a big focus on that, and that's really important as it's part of our inclusivity of the studies, so that we're reaching every patient that we can for the study. And for example, when we do like a reach out social media, we have this these great relationships with patient advocacy groups and patients themselves to feedback to us what we've created. So say we have created a load of posts and they said, oh, that's not really, that's not really relevant. We don't really want to like learn it. That's not for us. We'll take that on board. We'll take back the feedback and we'll say, right, what is next? What would actually be better for Germany to hear about, for example? What's more relevant for France to hear about? And some of the ways we've done it is that it's almost taken it away from translation, and it's been adapted for that country, in that sometimes the content is quite different. So if we're talking about the study, or there's a new patient ambassador or something like that, and that patient ambassador is set in, let's say, Italy, maybe France and Germany don't really need to know about it because it's not going to be relevant to them. They won't be able to watch the videos that person is putting out there. So we'll focus on that content for Italy, and then something different for France and Germany. So I know that's taken it away a bit from the localization, but it's more about really like adapting to the audience now. So the patient voice is put first, and it's not just some assumption that the content that we've got here in English, everyone needs to have it, and it needs to be translated into every language. I think there's this slowly coming around to more of a focus on, is it relevant for everyone as well? I don't know if you've seen this in the work. You may have translated things, you think that sentence just doesn't even need to be in there, especially when you go from certain languages. French can be quite a flowery language. It's very beautiful, very poetic, and you can sometimes see that English can be quite direct and quite short, that the content just reduces, especially if you've had multiple steps of translation revision and then a blind revision. It can actually reduce something from 1,500 words to 500 words almost, just because the type of language is so different. I guess that would take us into the transcreation realm, but it's still relevant for this because it's still targeting the patient group and where they are as well, where they live and the language they speak.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, I like to see, medical translators, for example. I think we are in some way, we end up being many times patient advocates, because we have to, yes, sometimes it's not just translating what it says in the original, but yes, you have to think and put ourselves in the patient's shoes, right? And okay, this doesn't make any meaning. And I think that Kokoro, you mentioned that in your experience as a nurse and as a translator, you feel that you do exactly that you are a vehicle of understanding. So, do you think that translators in these settings act as a patient advocates in that sense?
Yes, short answer. Yes, I really think that we act as a vehicle to help and advocate and support patients, because like when we think about the process of translating, like we first like look at the text and then translate, and then okay, does it make sense? Does it actually how does it sound to the patient? Do I like make the patients feel worried too much? Like I'm like it's gonna be, depending on the text, like if we're translating it, maybe just like asking about their conditions and the symptoms or daily activities. I don't want to sound like a little, how do I say, like, I don't want to cause any worries in the feelings, but at the same time, we need to know and we need to understand what they're thinking. And that is actually like when I was a nursing student, like hesitate to ask questions to patients because we don't want to hurt their feelings. However, that teacher told us that when the information we need to help the patient is, and there is no there is no question like bad question. We can ask them with a we can ask them questions. So now going back to the question from Ana Sofia, yes, we as a linguist, like a translator, we think about like we consider all sorts of like different level of information, and also like we think about like all the circumstances, all the context, and this is something, and therefore I personally think that the translators also should be involved in more how do you say, like localization meetings, or like in the
Like the
system,
planning,
not
like the
yeah,
early stage planning. Yeah,
Yeah.
not exactly, not just like receive the text to translate. We probably want to know what happened before and after, so we can have a great sense of like we can grasp a overall process, and we can definitely put that idea into the translation, and the more productive, more effective, and that's what I personally think.
definitely.
Sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was gonna say I've worked with you, Kokoro, for a while now, and it's amazing because you always look at the bigger picture. You always ask the right questions as well. So, like, how is this going to be used? Like, what type of patient would actually see this? Where would this text lead to? Like, is this even like, is this something that they would need to see? Would this make them feel a certain way? That kind of elements. And I think that takes it a lot beyond translation a lot of the time, because you're really analyzing the sentiment behind it.
And I
the
think
use.
Yeah.
And I
Yes.
think in terms of related to that, we have to remember that not every single patient community is the same. So you have some patient communities, that might be large, dispersed. It's a very, for example, common condition. Others which are rare diseases where, not very many people can even share the information because there's not that many people who even have that condition. Some patient communities are known as being highly activated, very forward, very open about the condition. Others are much shyer, are much more closed. And I think that also becomes really important to understand, because if all you're doing is doing a straight translation, you're not taking into account as you mentioned, Kokoro, the target audience and who is going to be reading this, and making sure that all of those sensitivities are being taken into account. Because, when you're producing information at the start, one of the most important things to ask yourself is, who is going to be receiving this information? What is that patient community like? And that has to come in when things are then being translated, and it's about that whole the localization, but also I don't know, there's not an equivalent word, but taking into account the actual characteristics of that particular patient community.
Yes. And on that note, and I'm sorry I can't remember the reference. So, but the other day I read that there are no hard to reach populations, but we are just looking in the wrong place. So there's no hard to reach population, and I think that translators could play an important role in that co-creation. The problem is that most often organizations that are creating these materials, these contents, are not familiar about the complexity of translation and localization for patients. So, Trishna, do you think that there's a sufficient knowledge about what translation involves and what exactly is translation, besides putting words from one language into the other. There's much more around it. And do you think that organizations understand that and put that in place, put the relevant measures in place?
I don't think that they do. And I think that comes from, unless you've learned a language, potentially to degree level, you don't necessarily understand those complexities. I mean, so my language is Spanish. That's the language that I translate from. And even within Spanish, you have a lot of complexities. There's different types of Spanish. The words that are used, for example, even in different countries within Latin America can be different. And that's not even, in counting the differences between Castellano, which is Spanish from Spain, and Latin American Spanish. Now, unless somebody has that linguistic knowledge, they just won't realize that these complexities exist. And something else which I find is particularly within the life sciences industry, there is a tendency, and I've spoken about this quite a bit, that when organizations put together global projects, basically global means Western Europe and North America, and they don't take into account actually the rest of the world. It's not actually global. And so the whole translation piece actually becomes irrelevant in certain ways to organizations, because they just conduct everything in English. Because if you're talking about North America and Western Europe, most people nowadays have got a pretty good level of English to be able to at least sit and understand meetings and understand, being able to read things. Particularly now we've got the internet, and so much information on the internet is in English. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done, even going back right to the very beginning, when companies are starting projects, they are starting to create materials, they are putting together, for example, a lot of organizations are now putting together what are known as patient advisory councils to get the patient voice heard. And they can often be called global, but like I said, are they truly global? Often they're not. So it's about thinking right from the very start that what do we mean? Who are we trying to reach? How do we get a truly diverse patient voice involved? And that's where translation comes in. So I think that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think the move to digital and virtual ways of working could potentially help. Because I think it makes it much easier to be able to, for example, I've sat in a number of meetings now where there's been live interpretation. I know this webinar is being translated into, I think it's 5 or 6 different languages. So I don't think there's any excuse anymore, to be honest. I mean, I don't know, Anna, whether you've had experience of the same, within the same thing, where if you've been working, for example, with sites, maybe across the world, and they haven't really taken into account this whole, well, actually, we need to remember that not everybody speaks English.
Yeah, completely. I think in some respects, some of it is around the availability of sites as well, and the simplicity of the networks that are already set up in Western Europe and the US and Canada, and the way that those healthcare systems work in general. But you're right that it's very blinkered in that it only focuses predominantly on those groups. I have worked on patient-reported outcomes for countries outside of that, but they're very rare. They're very few and far between. I remember being very excited because I had one in Icelandic, and then I had one in Runyankoli, which I didn't know of that language beforehand, in Kenya, but outside of that, it's mainly been Europe, Asia Pac, and US and Canada, and even in South America, it was to try and create a harmonized version of Spanish for Latin America, which I know for you on the call, like you'll just know that that's not possible. It's like trying to say that British English and American English is the same. It's not.
Same in Portuguese. I think that the problem is that we are organizations that don't think, that aim at creating global materials, global projects without taking all the aspects in consideration. I think that because they are thinking only in terms of language and not in terms of cultural aspects, and that goes beyond the language itself and the terminology used and the daily habits. For example, even, and Trishna, you mentioned digital solutions, and Ana has a lot of experience in adapting to digital solutions. Even those cultural aspects have to be taken into account when migrating to electronic format, right? And
Completely. Yeah, so you might have that in some countries you could do a study app because that would be quite common to use, be easier for them to interact with on a regular basis, and then some countries would be like, why is there an app? That's just a bit of a barrier. I just want to access a website and complete it as simply as I can. So I think even in that respect, it's taking a few steps back and seeing how it should be presented, who and in what way should it be, should the translations be delivered. But it's also made me think of something that Ana Sofia, you and I have been working on, the UI UX elements of it as well. So there's so much within translation and localization. It's almost not just the words themselves, it's everything that goes around it. So in terms of some patient groups, they might have difficulties with their sight, for example. So you could be translating something, but then you know that patient group would have really quite a lot of difficulty reading it because it's heavily formatted. It's heavily maybe stylized. The font is like too small, or the characters are appearing unusually on the page, or in a way that it just wouldn't be that simple for a patient to read. So it takes it out of the pure changing one language to another. It's also, how is this benefiting the patient? How can they actually see it, read it, follow it? And if it's covered in underlines and hyperlinks and all sorts going on, that's the moment to question as well and say, actually, would anyone be able to read this?
Yes, that's right. It's much more than language or adapting the terminologies. It's layout, it's colors,
Exactly.
and for that, I think that patient input is very relevant, and not only in the digital format, but for example, even creating even in paper format. I think that patients should be involved, and linguists should be involved, because to make sure that everything is fully
Understandable.
understandable.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's like Trishna was saying earlier, that it's almost like really putting yourself in the patient's shoes, and translators can take some step towards that. Definitely, I know yourselves, Ana, Sofia, and Kokoro. I know you do that. You're very empathetic as well, like with what you do, and you're really feeling the translation when you're doing it. But it's good. There's an importance there. You know that what you're doing is going to help people, and so you can really put more of yourself into that work by seeing it from their perspective, and also having the feedback from the patient, which is the most important part.
Yes. Yes, and Kokoro also has an additional perspective to bring to the table. That's the healthcare professional perspective. So when you're translating medical contents aimed at patients, you know that it has to be understood, but you also call on your knowledge and experience as a nurse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I translate patient-facing materials, I always think of the time that I was doing nursing, because like back in the time that I was making handouts manually without using any computer, I made a drawing and how to disinfect the wound, how to take care of the tubes and things like that. So I do not have like a precise example of like what kind of like the text that I like great examples of the text that I had to I was able to utilize my nursing experience, but I always have this like a little bigger picture and then some imagination in my head that this is going to be used by patients, and therefore that I have to imagine and get a clear picture of how it is going to be used. And that is, I don't know how to say, I'm not sure like if I'm answering to your question, but yeah.
You're
And
always considering both sides
yeah, I think
when
so.
you translate. Yes, and
Yeah.
it's really important. Um, so we're almost at the end of our hour. I don't want to miss the opportunity to discuss plain language summaries, because it's a topic that I think that it's very important in getting the patient voice heard. So, and Trishna, I know that you are engaged in this kind of projects of plain language summaries. So, do you think that the advent of plain language summaries will impact the production of translated materials?
So I think it will for a few reasons. So firstly, for anybody who doesn't know, so plain language summaries are basically what they say. They're plain language versions of technical documents. Now that can be technical documents in any industry. But within healthcare settings, there are sort of two broad types of plain language summaries. You have plain language summaries or lay summaries of clinical trial results. And then you also have plain language summaries of publications. So that could be a Congress abstract, it could be a conference poster, it could be a manuscript that has been published in a journal, for instance. Now, in the EU, there are regulations that are going to be coming into force, which mandates that any clinical trial that is run within a European site has to have a lay summary of the clinical trial results produced in the language of wherever the site is, within a certain period of time of the trial having finished. Now, just by virtue of that mandate, I think organizations and people are going to become much more aware of the importance of providing information in different languages. And because of that, I think that it's then going to extend to people are going to realize that actually, no, we shouldn't just be providing all this information in English. And hopefully things like Congress abstracts, conference posters, the plain language summaries of those will start to also be translated, because the value of plain language summaries for patients, the public, I talk about it actually not just being for patients, it's also for healthcare journalists. It's also for non-specialist healthcare professionals like nurses, general practitioners, for instance. If these plain language summaries are being made available in different languages, then we're going to be able to have a much more better informed patient community. And that can only be a good thing. So I think what it's going to do is hopefully it's going to trigger that change in mindset about how all medical information, all health information should just be in English, because initially there's going to be some things which are going to be mandated anyway. Hopefully that will start a domino effect where one thing will then lead to another.
Yes, and my question also about the plain language summaries is that they have to be drafted in a plain language, understandable by patients, caregivers, general population. But sometimes, and we as translators, we know sometimes the fact that the original is written in a plain language doesn't necessarily implicate that the translated version will be as in plain language as well. So perhaps in the future, after the establishment, the consolidation of this plain language practice, perhaps we could think about some kind of linguistic validation of these summaries. What do you think, Anna? Do you see this as a solution to ensure that it is in fact in plain language?
I think so. I think it could be done in a more basic way, perhaps not with such a level of with the cognitive debriefing element added into it. I think you could analyze the level of readership of the summary with doing maybe a back translation review and do an analysis step like that instead. But I think going back to what Trishna was saying, it's really a missed opportunity with keeping it all in English. You're not allowing vast patient populations to know what's going on, to learn about the results of a study that they most likely contributed to and were part of, and they're just rewarded with the inability really of finding out about what they participated in.
Yes. Do you think that, for example, we could work with more closely with patient organizations in the countries where the clinical research was conducted? That would be, in my opinion, a way to, one of the best ways to do it.
Definitely. Yeah, we work with patient advocacy groups just to design the studies, and really, if we know what countries they're going to be involved in, translators, revisers, linguists in general should be invited to those conversations from the start, because inevitably, there's things that are brought up within those studies that, I mean, we've had it where translators just they know a lot more about the country. They're usually in-country consultant for the study, and they can tell us, oh, well, you can't ask for the social security number. You can't do that. You can't. I mean, it's almost like legal counsel for at that point, and it's something that you really need to know at the very early phases. But because usually the translation steps are very much towards the end, they're usually the last part before a study is launched. A lot of fixes have to be made to incorporate these localization elements. So you could find that, oh, look, you've asked this, but you shouldn't really ask that. And you're kind of at a point there, well, it's all been decided. It's the study will go on. So as long as there's this really good consultation and the consultation between patient advocacy groups and translators, I think you couldn't go wrong, because the translator would have everything that they need to produce the best quality translation possible, especially if they're able to do cognitive debriefing as well, because then they're really getting into the feedback from patients from that country as well.
Kokoro, the plain language summaries apply, like Trishna said, to the European Union space. Do you Are you aware of this kind of initiative for example, Japan or other Asian country that you are aware of? Do you see that patients are equally engaged in this kind of materials?
Mm, great question. I personally have not seen many PLS has been being translated the standard, and it's not really happening. But at the same time, that I've been seeing that it's being offered okay in the publications we translated PLS here, and here is the page that you can jump to, and so I would say it's happening. But from a nurse point of view, I think it's a great idea to translate PLS as a standard, so that HCPs the general practitioners or nurses, we could use that information in the presentations that we show to the patients, when we explain about the treatments that they may be receiving. Okay, let's say that you're the patient, you've been diagnosed with a condition, and then now you want to know what will be the possibilities and what will be the options. Then, but as you may be able to imagine that at the doctor's office, you only have 15 minutes or so. So you're gonna do research at home, but at the same time there are too many information, and you can be overwhelmed. You're already feeling not well because you were diagnosed with an information, and at the same time, there's some patients do not want to listen to something new or something scary. However, if we standardize to translate and then make it translate PLS and then make it available, accessible as a standard, the information is there. It's something becomes normal, and then we can actually ensure that the patients do not get worried too much. So I think not only as a linguist, also a nurse, I think that is very important for us to translate PLS, and also available in the multiple languages.
Yeah, yes, you touch a great point when you mentioned for general practitioners, because we can't forget that not every healthcare professional knows everything about every condition and every aspect, health related aspect, and this kind of materials, whereas it's localization or localized materials taking into account the cultural aspects, or plain language plain language texts, will help healthcare professionals provide a better information to their patients, and therefore ensure that they are properly informed. So it's not about only making sure that patients understand, but also healthcare professionals who want to help their patients based on information that it's often very complex, right? So
Definitely. I just spotted that Sheila, someone watching, said Italian is also extremely flowery.
so
Beautiful
okay.
languages.
And speaking of the chat, I think that we're almost at the 1 hour mark. So we'll just have a quick break for questions. But before that, we'll watch a quick video from the panel sponsor. So now we're back, and if anyone has any question, you can go ahead and put them in the chat message or in the comments in the live feed. So in the meantime, we have two questions. One from Laura Pruneda. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. So how do you collect this information? How do you go about asking them how their service experience is going, especially in areas like inpatients, where we still have a lot of COVID protocols that make it impossible to visit them in person to ask these questions? So I don't know, does anyone want to answer, Anna?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this one. So I guess in terms of the feedback that we're collecting from patients, even with you've mentioned COVID, with the COVID protocols, the move has gone to being predominantly digital in the way that we've had to because of the new world, and so the feedback is generally now, rather than face to face, just to keep it safer, something that can be done on over a phone or over a video call, just like we're doing now. So there's different ways of doing this, and I think this is just going to be enhanced further and further. I mean, we have so many different ways of collecting the patient information in general. We've got things like their wearables. You can wear like smartwatches, and you can be completing your own data every day. I think some of us might be doing it now. I don't know if you've got a kind of Google tracker on your phone or something. You're providing data in different ways and feedback, and I think that'll just evolve, and it'll be more of a, is this a good experience? Is this not great? And it will do it in quite creative ways, and there's no burden as well to answer enormous questionnaires. So it could be something like as small as a smiley face and a sad face, or a neutral face type thing. And that's I think where we're going to go in this. And I think that the way that technology is changing translation, in that we've got neural machine translation now, and things like where we're able to do language processing a lot faster than we were able to before, it'll only enhance hopefully the quality of language and the clarity of language further on. Because even if you get something that is quite a poor machine translation, it can be some sort of point of reference that then can be enhanced and worked on with a professional translator to actually see where the improvement should be made and the corrections, because how terrible those can sometimes come out. But I think technology really will just enhance us and we'll hopefully be able to communicate far better than we've ever done before.
Yes. Before we jump to the next question, just let me just take a bit of a time from that and talk about what you mentioned about neural machine translation, and do you think what impact do you think artificial intelligence or neural machine translation will have on the linguistic validation and translation of medical and scientific information?
I can't imagine we'd be completely reliant on it, because again, you're lacking the human aspect of sentiment analysis, the areas of nuance and cultural approaches are not there, and I don't really imagine they could ever really be picked up in a way that if you're asking a patient, does this make sense to you?
Yeah.
Could you rephrase this in another way so you can check their understanding? Machine translation is not at that level. I feel like if we get to that point, then the robots are humans.
And I think that's really that's a really important point to make, and also for organizations to understand, because it's very easy to think, oh, okay, well, we've got the ability of, I don't know, using, just for argument's sake, Google Translate. Let's just stick everything into that. And without knowing the importance and the complexities of translation, but also the importance and complexities of incorporating the patient voice, it's impossible to actually fully understand why, just sticking things into Google Translate isn't going to produce what you actually need. And I think it's important to remember that actually we can't lose the human element, because at the end of the day, all of this information is going to be digested and processed by humans. And so we need to keep that human element in, whether it's to make sure that, like you said, Anna, about, the certain cultural nuances, the words that are used, the sentiment is there, but also to remember that in order to make sure that the patient voice is being properly incorporated, you need to involve the patients. And patients aren't machines.
Machines, not machines.
And I don't know if you, Ana Sofia and Kokoro, have had, terrible machine translations thrown at you and said, "Oh, please, can you edit that?"
Yes, and I think that for I don't know if Kokoro ever had to, I don't know, edit machine translation or, but I think that it's not how bad or how good it is right now for Japanese, for example.
Okay, I can talk about only my experience actually. I don't have the big data, from all over the world. So I personally think that the machine translation, like machine translation post editing, yes,
Yeah.
I work on that project quite regularly. I have not seen any great translation from that now. However, I see great improvement when it comes to other area of like subject matters, like general subject matters or IT. So I think based on that, I think it's excuse me, because now the technology is like advancing like rapidly, and the globalization is like always going on, and we change, like we use different new technologies are emerging all the time. So now what we should do is that use the machine translation for something repetitive, something standardized, so that we translators can really focus on what is very important, and like to translate something like that needs like a human touch, sentiment, and that is something like very important, and that is something that we can do in the future and even now. And we also need to keep ourselves up to date with all the technology, so that we can make a great use of it and not to lose any human part. But at the same time, we want productivity. We want things to go faster, more productive, effective. That's what I think in general.
Yes, but what cost? I think, and you probably will, the three of you will agree with me that, and like Trishna said, patients aren't machines; they are persons. So if what we gain in productivity, of course, in the ability to translate thousands and hundreds and thousands and millions of words, will lose that human touch probably. And will the patient voice be lost somewhere with our concern with thinking about if it's completely understandable, if it's completely culturally adapted? So the patient voice be ultimately lost if we only post edit machine translation?
I basically, yes, I think so. If you're not incorporating patients in the process, you will lose the patient voice. Just that's what will happen, and that goes for any part of the process of producing information and content and services and products. As soon as you stop consulting with patients, the patient voice will be lost. that's inevitable. So it's really important to make sure that doesn't happen, that we are still consulting with patients, we are still partnering with patients, to make sure that we do get that patient voice embedded, because we can't think that this is a simple process. It's not, and I don't think anybody. I don't think we should be shying away from that. We should be embracing that and saying, okay, it is a complex process. How do we now go about making sure that the end product is as relevant and as effective and as targeted as possible? So I think the short answer is we still need to be consulting with patients.
And Anna, in linguistic validation, for example, machine translation is really impossible to use. You can't use machine translation even from the start, even from the first translation step, like you mentioned, forward translation.
No, there would be no benefit in doing that anyway. I feel like the only step that you could maybe do it, but I don't think it'd be worth doing, would be if you did double back translation and one of them was a machine translation and one of them was still a person. But even then, you're probably running the risk of asking redundant questions of like, why was that translated as bread in the middle of a sentence that had nothing to do with that? And and then you can't ask it because it's a machine. I mean, you're going to waste time asking the lead translator, did you do this? And they're like, no. And so realistically, machine translation shouldn't be used for linguistic validation, because the whole point of linguistic validation is that there are always humans at every step of it, seeing whether that is the best turn of phrase, the actual cultural conceptual equivalence has been met. And that's something that a machine can't analyze. There's no tool that actually measures the conceptual equivalence. They can do changes of text, and they learn basically based on phrases. So certain established phrases will be fairly good because they've now been validated by so many people. But when you're looking at huge amounts of text, things where you're asking very nuanced questions like, oh, I've got butterflies in my stomach and that kind of thing, it can take a stab at it. It can try, but you really won't get the meaning that you want to have.
Yeah. And even with actual medical terminology and scientific terminology, in some languages you just don't have an equivalent, and so it has to be explained, but a machine won't necessarily know that. So in some languages there are certain conditions, I can't think now off the top of my head which ones, but that you don't actually have a translation for that particular condition. You have to actually explain what the condition is. Well, how is a machine to know that?
Exactly. You can have the same with some moods as well. So It might be that in English we've defined very distinct phases between like different phases of happiness, like elated, delighted, happy, and overjoyed. And then in some languages you might want to actually distinguish between all of those terms, and then you might go to another language which is like, we actually only have two. Can they cover all four? And that's where you really, a machine translation would just come out with the same word for each one, and you'd completely miss all of the nuance between the tones. And that's where the human translator would say, okay, overjoyed is, and then explanation of the concept behind it.
Yes, and even if machine translation gets the translation exactly right, grammatically right, each word is correctly translated, it might end up in a sentence that, for example, may be highly offensive in the target for the target culture, to the target language. So human touch is always necessary. Sheila says, what about jokes and irony or puns? So that's
Definitely.
that's some examples of something that probably should be avoided, for example, when creating multilingual contents, right? Avoiding some like jokes or puns. Avoid everything that is not easily replicated in the target language, for example, exactly for the difficulty to transfer it to the target language. Right?
Exactly. I think
Yeah.
that involves another level of creativity to translate things like jokes and puns.
Yeah.
I've done this previously when I was doing my translation masters and doing it with French authors. It was incredibly hard. I mean, just because of the complexity of the language structure of French didn't match the same syllable structure, didn't match the same. You couldn't end in the same way. You had to really write a brand new pun or a joke. And I don't know if, like between English and Japanese, Kokoro, if that
Yeah.
would be an easy task.
That is the hardest task that I ever had, actually. I've had to translate some puns, like especially when I translated the video game contents, for example. But for medical, like we don't really have to translate puns, but a machine translation or technology or AI, whatever it is, like the technology probably can understand the context to some extent. And I see that the improvement and probably um, you know, like probably that we can have it more. We can have more machine translation, but for puns, the thing is that language changes like perpetually, always. And then if we think about a situation with a global pandemic and then how we use the platforms, devices, and then with and technologies that changes, and with that, like our language, our what we say also change. So not only puns and jokes like that are so hard to translate. And the thing is that we are the language is living. It's not something fixed. So we must not forget to translate with by humans. That's what I
Yes.
think.
And,
Yes.
and actually,
Yeah.
what you were saying, Cora, about how language is living and it continues to evolve, that also applies to medical terms, the way we talk about certain conditions, about disabilities. I mean, the way that we spoke about illness and disability, for example, when I was growing up, so this was back in the 1980s, it was very different to what it is now. The acceptable terminology, how you refer to people with certain conditions, all of that changes. And it's important to remember that only humans really can understand those changes, and to know that, for example, there are many people who don't, who would prefer to be spoken about that they live with a disability. They don't want to be labeled as disabled, or that somebody, so I live with multiple sclerosis, and, within the MS community, there is a lot of debate as to when people are referred to as MS sufferers. Many people don't like to be referred to as MS sufferers. So, and these are all things which are very much, it's evolved. So whereas, we might have been able to translate something in a certain way, say 30 years ago, it won't be relevant now, because actually we can't use the same words, the same terminology, because of the way that we refer to certain health conditions and people living with health conditions. And also the fact that, illnesses evolve as well. I mean, who thought that, say even 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we'd all know what COVID-19 was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, that reminds me of this patient we had, like when I was working at this like head and neck surgery department. A lot of patients had lost their vocal cords, so they had to find another way to speak and communicate. And one of them was a professor. of a university, and he contributed to this technology to produce voice of the person. And I think there are some devices for those people who remove the vocal cords, and then the machine can speak for them, and it's very natural and things like that. So, but 20 years ago when I was a nurse, there were not such things. But now, like, there are like many things that are available to support patients, so that even maybe certain level of stigma will be just resolved and by itself, like by over time. And I find it like amazing. And we have to really like keep ourselves like updated with what is going on.
Definitely.
Yeah. The one final question, because we're almost out of time, but I would like to take this question to invite you to answer this question as a kind of a takeaway from our discussion, to share some takeaways that you might have, because I think that we addressed this at some point in our conversation. So how is it? It's a question from Sneha.
Sneha, that's how
Sneha.
you pronounce it. Yeah.
Thank you, Trishna. How is it possible to ensure that all patients are equally heard, regardless of the language they speak or the country they live in, when parity or equity isn't conceivable in situations where interlinguistic translation isn't needed? So, how is it possible to ensure that all patients are heard? Some suggestions or key takeaways from our discussion.
So I think that the key thing is that we need to make sure that patient engagement opportunities are equitable and they're open to all. It's about taking that one step back. So we talk about getting the patient voice heard, but often it's the same patients being heard all the time. We need to take a step back and look at why is this, and make sure that the opportunities are open for all. So that might mean providing translation services. That might mean making sure that opportunities are being advertised in different ways so that it's being seen by not only, for example, patient advocates, but people from, different communities, people who are maybe just getting on with their day-to-day lives and living with a condition. It's about making sure that opportunities are easy to access for people who work, for people who might have children. It's about making sure that these opportunities are there for anybody who wants to take part, because up until this point, the battle had really been about getting any patient voice heard. We know now how valuable that is. The next step is to make sure that it's open to all patients so that they have that opportunity to be able to shape the healthcare journey and the medicine's development life cycle.
And it kind of goes back to what your example you gave, Kokoro, with the patients who suffered from throat removal, that they've had to then have a different alternative way of communicating. And I think it'll become, as you're saying, Trishna, like multiple modes of getting this feedback from patients and actually reaching everyone. So digital will help massively. I think devices as well will help in a big way. The ability to maybe, do it through your phone, do it through your watch, be able to contribute in all these different ways, and to have the opportunity to come to workshops, that kind of thing. We're seeing now life science companies, they really are inviting patients to come and sit around the table and talk around the study design. It's not just like, we think we should do this, and just trying to assume a lot of these things. It's finally bringing them in, but again, it's making sure that everyone can go to be part of it. So in terms of, I think the next phase is really accessibility as well. Of how can they join? Is it easy for them to join? Do we even need like high speed internet? Can we do stuff offline? Like, can we do things in a different way? So absolutely everyone that should be involved is heard as well. It's a tricky one, but I think technology is going to help.
Yes.
Massively. Yeah.
Kokoro.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally we must not forget that the patient's voice needs to be heard. And we, if I talk about as a nurse, like, or like a healthcare professional, or like a specialist, we are the one who need to take initiative, because like a patient's voice can be absorbed quickly, and you know, that is something that we have to raise the awareness like continuously. Like we have to remember that all the time, and by doing so, we can then think like come up with like real action plans. Okay, like for the in the countries that are still in the development, like we can do the offline way, and like for the developed country, like we use digital. And but if we forget about this, I think that no, to remember this is like the fundamentally very important.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for summarizing the key aspects of what we should be doing and what in the future we should do as well. So well, I think we have reached the end of our time. Ooh, that sounds ominous.
Another reason why machines can't translate, and why certain things, when you say it in certain contexts in certain languages, don't necessarily go to the way that you were meaning for it to be conveyed.
So that's another key takeaway from our conversation. So thank you, Ana, Trishna, Kokoro, for being here in this panel with me. It was my pleasure to chat with you about getting the patient voice heard, and thank you for everyone watching us. See you soon, and thank you for being here. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Bye.